Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We are going to be talking about a lot of different topics over the next hour and kind of stay into some of the issues in the news. And of course, if you want to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Kind of the theme this week is government overreach. And I might just mention that we have a banner that you can click on, find out a little bit more about government overreach. My commentary today is on that subject as well. And if you receive any kind of mail from us, either email or printed material, you probably have something in your inbox or in your mailbox about this topic, because we have certainly seen a lot of evidence of government overreach, and that'll be a theme that kind of works our way through the week. But I thought for just at least a segment, we would focus on the pandemic and was it man-made? Because you know that asking that question about 14 months ago would relegate you to believing in some kind of conspiracy theory. And the first person I believe that raised that question was an individual who was the senator from Arkansas, Tom Cotton, and he was vilified, he was criticized. Individuals that ever raised that question on social media found themselves deplatformed, all sorts of things. And now look at the U-turn. And so I thought I might just go through this for a little bit of time. I know other talk shows have been talking about it, but we might focus on it as well. And then we will get into some other issues. One of which is, as I've said before, if you pay people not to work, what happens? Well, they don't go looking for work. And so John McCormick said, what did Congress expect when it made unemployment worth $15 an hour? And it's a really good piece because it reminds us that on one hand, you had Republicans and a number of Democrats vote against the idea of a $15 minimum wage. But then those Democrats turned right around and continued the benefits that essentially paid people more than $15 an hour to stay home. And Senator Ben Sasse has had some things to say about that, so I thought we would focus on those issues. And then before the hour is up, I wanted to bring our attention back to what is going on in the border, because I've even seen some columns coming out saying, where's all the conversation about border crisis? And one I read the other day was in the Washington Post. I thought, okay, just a reminder that we need to talk about that. Oh, no, it was kind of a puff piece for the Biden administration saying, we got all the problems solved now. That's why we're not hearing about a crisis. Well, first of all, you maybe aren't listening to all media, because I've actually been following a number of individuals that have taken the time to go down to the border. Some have been there. I think Congressman Andy Biggs said he's been down there 6 times or something like that, and all sorts of other people going down with cameras and taking some of that. So we don't want to forget that issue. And we'll get into a couple of other topics as well. And so that will be as much as we can possibly fit in this hour. Then, if you find yourself saying, I'd like you to go in depth in some of those topics, the good news is tomorrow we'll have Jim Dennison on, and I think we have 4 different topics we will address, some of which are part of his daily article. And so we'll get into it in some detail. But the next hour is going to be a time in which we're going to talk about the Constitution. It's kind of a teaching hour. Dr. Charles Kesler will be with us. His book is called A Crisis of the Two Constitutions. And if you have my booklet I'm holding up right now on constitutional interpretation, or of course if you listen to any of the conversation we've had on this program about some people come to the Constitution with the idea of an originalist perspective. That is, what was the original meaning of these words, either when they were part of the Constitution or when they were written into the laws by Congress. And then you have the progressive interpretation saying we can just change things as we want. And so this whole idea of constitutional interpretation, which I have in my booklet, which is still available to anybody that would like to get a copy, is going to be relevant. Also, my most recent one on the Federalist Papers, a Christian view on the Federalist Papers, because if you really kind of want to understand the Constitution, the Federalist Papers are almost like a commentary on the Constitution, the way some commentaries are like a commentary on the Bible. So we will spend some time with Dr. Charles Kesler next hour, look at, first of all, the original founders' view of the Constitution. Then we'll look at the progressives' view of the Constitution. Then we're going to say, okay, what can we do? And how can we address some of those issues? So that's next hour. And so that will be an opportunity, kind of as a teaching time. You might want to get something to write with, take some notes, and learn a little bit more about the Constitution. But let's get into the pandemic. The first article I've posted is by Michael Brendan Doherty. What if the pandemic was man-made? And he reminds us early on that when we had this pandemic, which we later called COVID-19, there were a lot of people looking at history books and trying to say, okay, how did we handle plagues in the past? And we had people, of course, shutting themselves off from the public to prevent the spread. Others sometimes actually went the other direction, leaving almost a hedonistic lifestyle, not wanting to miss out. But if nothing else, there were arguments being made that this was probably a natural phenomenon. But now we have the possibility that this is very different than what we've had in the past. And that is, as he puts it, a handful of guilty humans and governments that are responsible for that. And that comes due in large part to some of the reporting that is done, first of all, by the Wall Street Journal, in which they have been able to document that as far back as November 2019, several staff at the Wuhan lab fell sick and had to be hospitalized. And, of course, we on this program have given due credit to Nicholas Wade, that article we posted weeks ago, The Origin of COVID Following the Clues. This is an individual that spent 4 decades as the science editor for the New York Times. And once he and also some of these scientists writing in Science magazine, there were 18 different scientists suggesting that this should be actually investigated, that sort of turned things around pretty quickly, which gets to another article we'll deal with after the break. Don't let the media get away with the U-turning on the lab leak theory. If there's any evidence that you needed for why you need to always reevaluate what you see, read, and hear, and maybe get a copy of our booklet on media bias and learn a little bit more about discernment and those kinds of things, it is the fact that anybody this time a year ago that would be alleging what almost everybody is alleging now would actually find themselves ridiculed, maybe deplatformed, censored from social media. And so a year ago, it was hard to find more than maybe a handful of people that suggested that maybe the virus came from the lab. Now, I think it'd be hard to find a virologist anywhere except maybe in China, under force, who would say that it came from the wet market. So what a turnaround that has been. And to put this in perspective, Michael Brendan Doherty did something else. He said, think of one of the greatest death tolls of recent memory, and that would be the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl. Now, the immediate death toll was about 30 to 50. Of course, Russia isn't exactly transparent either. But even if you talked about anybody that might have gotten radiation poisoning, anybody else that even came down with other health issues, you can't come up with a number that's even close to 2 million. By contrast, even using the World Health Organization, we already have 3.5 million people that have died of COVID-19, anywhere between $16 trillion to $28 trillion, depending on which estimates you use, on lost global economic output. And of course, we've had the school closures of about affecting 1.6 billion young children. So when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about whether or not this was man-made, right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the 3 branches of our constitutional government are the executive, legislative, and judicial. Over the years, you may have written these names on a school test. You may have even shouted them out as answers in a trivia game. But the 3 branches of government are much more than just a school lesson or a trivia game answer. They're a big reason our freedoms have been protected so well for nearly 250 years. We enjoy such liberty and government continuity because the framers of our Constitution had a belief about human nature that comes from the Bible. While there are good aspects of human nature, there's also great potential for evil because of sin. That's why the framers knew that it would be a very bad idea to concentrate all government power in the hands of just a few people. The 3 separate branches of government check each other's power. but people in government can still be guilty of overreach. Right now, for example, certain members of Congress are considering measures that would greatly decrease accountability in government. Two of the main ways they are attempting to accomplish this power consolidation are court packing and ending the filibuster. James Madison at one point predicted that the legislative branch of the government would be the greatest threat to the separation of powers. Thankfully, we do have another check on government power in the United States, and that is us. Through elections, local government, U.S. citizens have the ability to hold government accountable when it goes too far. At Point of View, we want you to stay informed about the issues of the day and share important resources with you so that you can stand up for freedom effectively. If you'd like to support Point of View and help more Americans gain access to the kind of information and resources provided on this program, please consider giving or becoming a member of our Truth Team.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. First article we've posted, what if the pandemic was man-made? I think there is good evidence that indeed it may be. And I'm being willing to even crawl out on a limb and say that I don't even think some of this was an accident that just developed. It seems to me that gain-of-function research was taking place. And you might say, well, then why aren't we investigating that? Well, I'm going to have another revelation that's going to come in just a minute, but let's work our way through this one, which simply takes us back to the fact that when we look at some of the facts and figures, this has been, and I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, an incredible devastation. 3.5 million people at least have died and will continue to die. You look at what's happening in India, Brazil, and other places. The death toll is not over yet, although for us in this country, it's starting to be less significant. And I sort of expected that, one, because the Biden administration is here, and two, because of the vaccine. So those daily counts we used to get, we haven't heard those in a long time. And part of that is due to the fact that those numbers are lower, but also due to the fact that we don't want to remind people that about 30% of the people in America that have died after Joe Biden was inaugurated. And when there's always this attempt to blame the president for something that the president, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, didn't do, they didn't even want to cover that. But why are we now hearing about this? And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that China has just an overt influence in our society. There are a couple reasons why that is the case. It is the largest market. You try to find anybody in the NBA, for example, to criticize China right now, and they learned their lessons from a year ago, and that is not the case. You find individuals that are right now trying to get their films out, and of course you had one just the other day where, was it Fast and Furious 9, and he said something about Taiwan, and China got upset and had to issue an apology, and these kinds of things. So a lot of it has to do with also the argument that you don't want to be seen as anti-Asian. And I make a distinction, and we always make a distinction. And whether we've had Gordon Chang on this program talking about this, or a handful of other people like Gary Bauer and others, between the political party, the Chinese Communist Party, and Chinese people. And so certainly the Chinese Communist Party probably knew a lot more than they let on, convinced convinced the World Health Organization to say some things which now we pretty much are assuming are lies. And then pretty much the mainstream media in this country and in other countries just fell in lockstep. Which brings us to our second article that we've posted here today, which has the resting title, "Don't Let the Media Get Away with You Turning on the Lab Leak Theory," because the author reminds us that what we are talking about is a theory that used to be considered, and this is his words, a fringe nut job idea, now is considered mainstream and expert approved opinion. And if you had any doubt about that, let me quote from Dr. Anthony Fauci. This was an interview he did from National Geographic a year ago, excuse me. And he said, if you look at the evolution of the virus in bats and what's out there now, the scientific evidence is very, very strongly leaning towards this could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated. Everything about the stepwise evolution over time strongly indicates that this virus evolved in nature and then jumped species. And he even went on to say that Dr. Fauci does not entertain an alternative theory that how somehow this was brought into a lab and then accidentally escaped. And yet there is pretty good evidence now that it wasn't just brought into the laboratory, it was the kind of investigation being done. Again, let's give credit where credit is due. One of the people that broke the story is Dr. Nicholas Wade, who was the science editor of New York Times for 4 decades, Origin of COVID, Following the Clues. And then, if that was not enough, as I mentioned, you have 18 scientists who including one that worked in the lab itself, penned a letter to Science magazine stating that a lab leak theory needed to be investigated. Then you have Donald McNeil, the former New York Times science writer, writing an explanation of gain-of-function research. And then, of course, we were off to the races finally. But it took that long to get to a point where, indeed, we have a lot of evidence now to suggest that if we look at that genome, and I quoted Dr. David Baltimore, Nobel Prize winner, and others that said even to his wife, you know, when I look at this, it doesn't look like it's from nature. It looks like it was genetically engineered, and that is the case. So let me now go out on a limb a little bit and explain 2 things that maybe are in the back of your mind. Why didn't we investigate that? And it turns out we only are now, after the fact, finding out that there was an investigation that was pretty much quietly initiated under the Trump administration, under the leadership of the Secretary of State then, Mike Pompeo. And so there was a State Department investigation, but it turns out that when Joe Biden and his administration came into office, they shut it down. So there was a Trump-era investigation into the origin of COVID-19, and that stopped starting in January. And so as a result, we only found out about that more recently. Let me read this one coming. Let's give credit where credit is due. CNN broke the story Tuesday. The Biden administration terminated a closely held investigation initiated by former President Donald Trump's administration that sought to substantiate whether COVID-19 leaked from the Wuhan biolab. The investigation, which was conducted from the State Department's Arms Control and Verification Bureau, was, quote, an honest effort to probe what many initially dismissed, that China's biological weapons program could have had a greater role in the pandemic's origin in Wuhan. Again, that's a quote from CNN. We can go into some more of the details, but I think what is so striking is that this also was investigating the possibility that this might have been developed as a bioweapon. I would suggest to you that if 14 months ago I'd even said this on this program, or anybody else had, they would have said, you're completely off base. It came from the wet market. Even if it did come from the lab, they were not doing bioweapons research. And now you're having some people even willing to crawl a little bit further out on that limb. And one of those individuals, you might as well know his name, is David Asher. He's a former top investigator for the State Department. And he, according to an interview that that he did with Fox News, has worked on some of the most classified intelligence investigations, and he believes that the COVID-19 pandemic began when the bioweapons research at the Wuhan lab actually resulted in an accidental virus leak. Remember, even a year ago, we were talking about the fact that there were all sorts of previous stories about leaks out of this lab. One of the things that was so shocking, again, that was in the piece that came out by Nicholas Wade, is that when you look at the facility, the Wuhan facility, there is a stage 4, or there's a better word for it, but a classified 4 level, and indeed those are where you do some of the most dangerous, and we've always referred to it as one of those kinds of labs until he said no, it was only a level 2, which is kind of analogous to what you get when you go into a dental office. So, again, this is the case. David Asher, by the way, said that the Wuhan Institute of Virology is not the National Institute of Health. It was operating a secret classified program. In my view, and I'm just one person, my view is that it was a biological weapons program. Well, we don't have any evidence of that. We don't have evidence of a lot of this, and I don't know that we'll ever be able to collect it because the one investigation at least the government was doing was shut down by the current president. You might say, well, now we're being assured that that will be investigated by the World Health Organization. Let me ask you, how much do you trust them? Didn't think so. Well, we take a break, though. Let's talk about the fact that this week we really are focusing on this idea of government overreach, and that is illustrated by the banner that we have here. We're talking about, and we'll even get into that conversation in the next hour, about the attempt to try to increase the size of the Supreme Court and turn it into a political weapon. We've seen all sorts of debates about getting rid of the filibuster in the Senate. We've talked about everything from revamping election laws nationwide, the Equality Act, and of course a little bit later we'll get into the issue of immigration and some of the laws that want to be passed there. And this is why, if nothing else, we encourage you to visit the website pointofview.net. Click on that button if you can help us out, because we are featuring some of the issues of government overreach, and that is actually the title of my commentary today, which you can read in its entirety, and it gets you into, again, some of the real concerns that we have. Fits very well with the conversation and teaching we're going to have in just an hour with Dr. Charles Kesler. But when we come back, I'm going to move on to some other issues, because there are lots of things on the agenda. We'll cover all that and take your phone calls right after this.
According to one definition, a catalyst is an agent that provokes or speeds significant change or action. According to founder James Madison, tyranny is the accumulation of all powers in the same hands. So what do those definitions have to do with each other? Here's the disturbing truth. Members of the federal government are blatantly trying to seize as much power as possible, pushing us toward tyranny. To stop tyranny, we need a catalyst: you. The most important check on government tyranny is the American people. But many Americans don't know how to stand up to the government. They need access to programs like Point of View, where listeners are not just informed, but empowered to take meaningful action. When you give to Point of View, you become a catalyst, because you're giving more people the tools they need to stand for freedom. Be the catalyst America needs to stop tyranny. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
You know, when I traveled last week, I was in Georgia and South Carolina, and we had evening meetings, and I had a chance to meet so many of you that support Point of View. And if there's one theme that showed up many times, it was a question from the audience or else maybe a conversation afterwards. Where is the common sense in America? And, of course, I have told you before, I have a sermon that I gave a while back when I spoke in a church in Florida on the death of common sense, based upon some principles in the Old Testament, and I may even bring that to this program sometime. But my answer to that is, first of all, there is a lack of common sense. And part of that has to do with the fact that we have especially a whole generation of young people and even some older people as well that aren't growing up where common sense is being reinforced. Let's face it, if you grow up on the farm, you grow up in a suburb, you got two parents, maybe you have grandparents and some others, you know, they're very quickly you'll learn to come in out of the rain. You recognize that saving is better than spending. You recognize that there's value to hard work, on and on and on, all the things that we consider to be part of common sense. And even if you're a stupid teenager, and all of us at one time were, there's usually a grandfather, an uncle, or something that said, boy, now come on, you just need to get together. You need to get this together here. You got the wrong idea. You're going the wrong direction. And there was always a lot to reinforce it. A generation growing up today without as much parental involvement, spending disproportionate amounts of time in front of video games and TV programs and all that, and not even necessarily understanding the relationship between cause and effect. That's part of it. So we do have a loss of common sense, but we have something else. I don't think everybody's lost common sense. I think there's a lot of people that have common sense, but they're terrified when we are told that we are supposed to not use common sense. A classic illustration is when you have a boy that thinks he is a girl and now is considered a transgender girl and is allowed to compete in sports. I would have to say that most of the parents, whether their kids participate in that athletic event or not, think that's inappropriate and that's wrong and it's unfair. How many of them dare to speak out for fear of being called transphobic, homophobic, intolerant, a bigot? And so in some respects, there is a lot of push for people not to use common sense. And common sense is sometimes in short supply in Congress, which brings us to our third article. Why did Congress, asking John McCormick, expect, and what did Congress even expect when it made unemployment worth $15.45 an hour? Now, you might wonder what he's talking about. Well, it turns out that on March 5th, you had all 50 Senate Republicans and 8 Senate Democrats reject an amendment that would have raised the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. The argument is it would kill jobs and all the rest. There are a lot of places that do pay $15 an hour, but to mandate that was a question that you had at least 58 members of the Senate that actually did not think that was a good idea. But then John McCormick goes on to point out that just at the very same time, those 8 Senate Democrats who opposed raising the minimum wage, nevertheless voted to extend until September of this year a $300 per week unemployment bonus. And so if you take the $300 plus the benefits of $318, that's $618 a week, and divide that by a standard 40-hour work week, get out your calculator, that's $15.45 an hour. In other words, basically, you would have to be making more than $15 an hour for there to be any justification for you to think seriously about going to work. And that, I think, is one of the best explanations for why back in April, when they expected that there would be 1 million jobs created, there were only 266, and yet the Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates that there are 7.4 million job openings. Now, this is not unexpected, and let's give kudos to Senator Ben Sasse, the Republican senator from Nebraska. He said, look, people are pro-work, but they're also rational, and they're not going to take a pay cut to go take a job. Now, again, there are some that have said that whether it's Ben Sasse, Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, whoever it might be, Lindsey Graham, when they argue this, they're implying that Americans are lazy. By the way, some are. You've met them, right? We know some lazy people. Of course we do. But that's not the point. They're rational people. And Senator Ben Sasse is saying, look, a lot of people would like to go back to work, but they have this perverse choice between doing the thing that's best for their family in the short term and doing the thing that's right to contribute to society in the long term. And so, again, Ben Sasse is saying, when we pay people over $600 a week for a 40-hour week, and some of them aren't working 40 hours, by the way, when you get that benefit, you can see that you would have to be paying people more than that. Now, Ben Sasse, again, a very thoughtful individual, showing once again that a Harvard degree and an Oxford degree are not necessarily intellectually incapacitating. He brings a lot of common sense, a lot of good Nebraska common sense to all this. Simply has introduced what's called the National Signing Bonus Act. I'm not so sure I'm completely in on that, but nevertheless, it's now saying we would give people a signing bonus to actually go get a job, which sounds to me like the kind of thing we offer to college athletes to join the NFL or something like that. But nevertheless, the bottom line is, even though he's tried to push that, it's gone nowhere. There's not one Senate Democrat that's endorsed that idea. And so if you were waiting for the federal government to resolve this issue, you can wait a long time. But the good news is nearly half of the states, that is 23 states, have now decided to cut off these unemployment bonuses. Now, as you might imagine, they all tend to be Republican governors and legislatures, but nevertheless, that is a recognition that when you pay people not to work, common sense would tell you, guess what? They probably won't go to work. And so if you have some thoughts about that, 1-800-351-1212. I did a commentary on this a while back, but some of you might want to have this particular article. It's the third one because it actually runs the numbers. I might put this in a future commentary as well because it illustrates again that right now Congress, through its various proposals, are paying people more than $15 an hour not to work. And so even while people are complaining that they didn't pass a $15 an hour federal minimum wage, essentially what they're doing is, in a backhanded way, doing that as well. Let me, before I take some phone calls, and by the way, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, let me take you to the border. And this article is one that I had to look for. It was in USA Today. I did kind of a Google search and saying, is anybody bringing some perspective on what's happening at our border? And this comes from Lacey Cooper. You might say, well, who is she? Well, she's been the Border Security Section Chief for the U.S. Attorney Office of the District of Arizona. She's been a county and federal prosecutor. And before we take a break, let me just give you a few things on the table. I'll take a phone call, if nothing else, and then might get into some on-the-spot evidence that I've been able to collect from some people that have just more recently been down at the border. But anyway, she says, for the last 15 years, I protected people in Arizona and Americans from dangerous criminals. Of course, she's worked in the U.S. Attorney Office in the Southwest area. She sees, in some respects, how decisions are made. But she says, I also understand the danger, because she says, I've had face-to-face conversations with cartel members and listened to wiretaps on their phones. I've investigated them for drug trafficking, human smuggling, murders, and mutilations. That was my job as the Border Security Section Chief in the District of Arizona. She points out then that in March, the flood of immigrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border was 67% higher than in the same time just a little over a year ago, when the United States last experienced a surge of immigrants on the border. And as a result, the Homeland Security Secretary said we're on pace to encounter more individuals on the southwest border than we have in the last 20 years. That's a statement from the Biden administration. And so as a result, she points out that there was a lot of media frenzy. There was even an attempt from the Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton to sue the Washington establishment and was successful. And so he stopped that 100-day moratorium, but the Biden administration simply issued replacement guidance, and there we are. So she talks about, For example, prosecuting a Honduran who had been denied asylum but returned to the United States and got into an altercation in which he hit a victim in the head with a metal bar, fracturing her skull. The resulting aggravated assault conviction was not an aggravated felony. We come back from the break. I'm going to point out the fact that we have just really some bizarre rulings that have come down, even from some of the federal courts, suggesting that what you and I would call a felony is not. And so because it's not a felony, we can't deport these individuals. And even sometimes we just let them back into the general population. And her reminder is how dangerous this is. It is not only affecting your jobs, it's also affecting your security. And this is the fourth article that she wrote for USA Today. And I would encourage you to read it in its entirety. Let's take a break, though. I'll also take some phone calls from you, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the things we were just talking about a minute ago is when you pay people not to work, sometimes they don't go to work. But I think Wayne in Arizona wants to remind us that there is some value in going to work. So, Wayne, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. Do we have you there? Well, maybe we lost him. Okay, well, he was just going to simply talk about some of the benefits of working. You know, as Christians, we recognize that work is really important. And when we are engaged in what the Bible refers to as sloth or gluttony or inattention, those are some issues that certainly are the case. And so as you go to our website, pointofview.net, you're going to find one of the articles, the third article, I called it Paid Unemployment. And I did mention that there are a number of states where they have actually decided they were going to do something to actually cut that off. And if you'd like to know whether or not your state is one of those, there's a perfect link that takes you to the 23 states that have indeed cut off some of those benefits. And of course, if you find yourself in a different state, especially if you have a Democratic governor and legislature, you might take some of the material we have and say, why are we not considering this? Because if you're like me, as I've been traveling around, I see help wanted or hiring signs everywhere. Certainly the case. We'll take some more phone calls in just a minute. 1-800-351-1212. But we're talking about this issue of what is going on at our southern border. And again, some very good pieces and some facts and figures from Lacey Cooper, because she points out that, you know, you've had a federal court ruling that actually seems to be suggesting that even what we sometimes would refer to as a murder conviction would not qualify as an aggravated felony. She goes on to say that one Oregon robbery conviction was also excluded from that definition. Then even the issue of child pornography convictions sometimes do not qualify in that regard. And so some of those come from the Ninth Circuit Court in California. But then you also have the Second Circuit Court that a conviction for unlawful firearms trafficking was not considered an aggravated felony. And the Third Circuit Court found that a woman in her 30s who was convicted of what we would consider to be statutory rape was not an aggrieved felon. So when you start working your way through all of these, you see that there are individuals that are not being deported because they don't meet the threshold that is oftentimes established by the federal government for deporting these people, and instead they're allowed back into the population. And so it's a really concerning article that comes from an individual that has spent some time working on all of that, and I wanted you to see that, and it's our fourth article on our website, pointofview.net. Real quickly, let me give you also maybe a hands-on feel for what's going on in the border. I live in the state of Texas, and just recently Brandon Waltons and Michael Quinn Sullivan had a chance to go to the Texas-Mexico border. Matter of fact, our good friend Colonel Alan West was down there the other day actually doing some video, and all sorts of people that I've run into have been down there. But here's what Brandon Waltons and Michael Quinn Sullivan said. They said the situation along the Texas-Mexico border has gotten worse. You wouldn't know that from the mainstream media, but that is the assessment that has come from the Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton after meeting with local law enforcement officials in Laredo yesterday. This particular piece I've got shows what are called stash houses. Now, again, if you're not along the border, you're probably going to learn a little bit as we work our way through this, because there are about what are called 700 of these stash houses operating in Laredo, in which illegal aliens, people like the phrase undocumented workers, but they're really illegally here and have been initially crossing the border. Then they said as we walked along the Rio Grande north of Laredo, the Border Patrol agents pointed out cartel spotters, and you can see some of those pictures there as well. These are just a few hundred yards away, and their job is just spotters. They work for the cartel. They try to track where American law enforcement is, and of course the cartels carefully track the Border Patrol shift changes, their travel patterns, their response times, so they can better traffic the people, weapons, and narcotics into Texas. Now, sometimes they guess wrong and there's a confrontation, and that's never a positive either because of the incredible amount of firepower that these cartels have as well. Now, both Brandon Waltons and Michael Quinn Sullivan say that while Democrats in the media paint a picture of illegal aliens as families seeking a better life, the reality, he says, is, and they say, is more stark. The National Border Patrol Council had told us that upwards of 94% of those crossing in the Laredo sector are single men with violent records. And of the 52,000 apprehensions so far in this fiscal year, just under half are what are called other than Mexicans, OTMs. Those are other than Mexicans. And as I pointed out before, I've got this piece here with about 60 different nations around the world that are represented by some of these apprehensions that are taking place. And then one thing as well, a common theme was that every bit helps. The deployment of the National Guard troops, state and local officials, and all the rest, while those bodies serve as a visual deterrent, none actually have the authority to detain the illegal aliens and send them back across the border. Without bold action on Texas' part, the troops on the border are window dressing. And so you have the Attorney General of the state of Texas, Ken Paxton, who is actually trying to force through various actions officials to deport illegal aliens and the rest. And there have been many that have simply called on the governor to actually say, if you're not going to actually deal with the border, then we in the state of Texas need to do so, which is why the other day when Greg Abbott, the governor, did not do so, Tucker Carlson on Fox News referred to Greg Abbott as a total fraud on border security issues. And these two individuals said what we learned yesterday kind of makes us think that Tucker Carlson was being nice. So this is what's going on the border, even if the mainstream press is not covering it. So those are just a few topics that we have addressed this hour. We will get into some more of those contemporary issues tomorrow, and then in the next hour we will have a very good friend, Jim Dennison, who will get into some of his daily articles that address those in more detail. But just before we take a break, let me mention just a few things that we have here. And the first is that we encourage you to visit our website, and when you do so, you will find that there is a banner, and it's a quote from James Madison. The very definition of tyranny is when all powers are gathered together in one place. My commentary today talks about the fact that you probably learned about the three branches of government. Karen even has a picture of legislative, executive, and judicial. And of course, you've written those on a school test. You may have even shouted them out during a trivia game, but the reality is we recognize the importance of having separate branches of government. But James Madison and the other founders and even the framers of the Constitution were very concerned about government overreach, which we'll get into perhaps a little bit more in our next hour as we talk about the crisis of the two constitutions with Dr. Charles Kesler. But if you appreciate our attempts to continue updating you and educating you and hopefully even empowering you to make a difference and to contact your members of Congress and to recognize that we're facing an almost unprecedented time of government overreach, that's one of the reasons why we encourage you to visit the website pointofview.net. Click on that donate button, or perhaps if you receive the email or even a printed appeal letter that you might respond to that, because that is one of the things we're gearing up for, because we see this battle coming fast and furious over the next couple of months, and that's why we cover these very important issues every single day here on Point of View. Next hour, kind of a teaching time. We're going to sit back and learn a little bit more about the Constitution, its history, and how to interpret it correctly. We'll be back right after this.
According to one definition, a catalyst is an agent that provokes or speeds significant change or action. According to founder James Madison, tyranny is the accumulation of all powers in the same hands. So what do those definitions have to do with each other? Here's the disturbing truth. Members of the federal government are blatantly trying to seize as much power as possible, pushing us toward tyranny. To stop tyranny, we need a catalyst, you. The most important check on government tyranny is the American people, but many Americans don't know how to stand up to the government. They need access to programs like Point of View, where listeners are not just informed, but empowered to take meaningful action. When you give to Point of View, you become a catalyst, because you're giving more people the tools they need to stand for freedom. Be the catalyst America needs to stop tyranny. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you listen to Point of View any length of time, you know that we spend some time talking about the Constitution for obvious reasons. This is my booklet that talks about constitutional interpretation, because there are two very different views about how to interpret the Constitution. And you recognize that oftentimes we talk about that because we have Kelly Shackelford with us. Matter of fact, he'll be with us this Friday as we talk about some of these religious liberty issues, or we oftentimes have other lawyers on the program talking about some of these very important issues, whether it's constitutional issues or criminal justice issues, and a variety of others. And so trying to understand how we should accurately interpret the Constitution is very key. And the most recent booklet I just had come out is our view on the Federalist Papers, taking some of the things I've written about in that regard, because if in some respects you want to understand how to really use the Constitution and interpret it accurately, the Federalist Papers, written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, really give you, if you will, sort of a commentary on the Constitution. So those are some great resources that we have made available to you, but also want to turn your attention to this new book, came out earlier this year, with the title Crisis of the Two Constitutions: The Rise, Decline, and Recovery of American Greatness. And it's really broken into, if you will, three sections, because it's a goal to really try to, first of all, understand the Constitution of the founders, then the constitutional interpretation of the progressives, starting maybe with Woodrow Wilson or even maybe before, and then a final section looking at how conservatives have looked at this from Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump. And so it's a fascinating book. It is a book that you can find out more about by going to our website, pointofview.net. And of course, we are going to be talking with the author. That is Dr. Charles Kesler. He is the editor of the Claremont Review of Books, also a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, professor of government at Claremont McKenna College, author of a number of books, but one that I thought I might highlight, one that he co-edited with William F. Buckley Jr., Keeping the Tablets, Modern American Conservative Thought, and his latest edition of the Federalist Papers, one of the best-selling ones in America. So, Dr. Kesler, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be with you. It sounds like you've been working in these vineyards for a very long time yourself.
Well, again, I know who Harry Jaffa is. I, of course, worked with George Carey at Georgetown, if you know who he is, and a variety of others.
Of course,
and so
yes.
These are things that we've talked about. And so we really want to use this hour to kind of educate our listeners. I said this is going to be kind of a teaching program. Pull up something to write with, and you can kind of learn a couple of points. But I thought we'd get right into it. And the first thing is in the first chapter, the founders and the classics. You know, when I started reading the Federalist Papers in graduate school, or even before that, the Constitution. But when you start reading the Federalist Papers, or you start reading, as I've also done, the sermons of the 18th century, and then some of the quotes and the letters and the notes from the Constitutional Convention, these were very well-educated individuals who were very steeped in the classics, and they understand political theory. And it is hard for me to imagine today that we could find the same kind of individuals on the university who brought the depth of understanding of human nature and of politics and polity that we had with those individuals that were actually given the task of forming the Constitution.
Yes, no, the intellectual quality and the moral quality of the founders, of course, still sets a kind of standard for public men in America, for holders of public office. And our current generation of politicians, I have to say, is considerably inferior to the founding generation.
Yes,
but really also to several other great generations of public men in American history who had really better educations than our current generation has, I'm afraid. I mean, the founders really did set the standard, as you imply, because this was a generation that read Latin and Greek, and many of them read Hebrew and other and modern languages as well. And even someone like George Washington, who knew no language but his American English, was a very serious mind in his own way, and who knew the difference between smart, well-educated, patriotic advisors and those who didn't have those qualities.
One of the things that we are focusing on this week, Dr. Kesler, is government overreach. And if you go to the website, pointofview.net, you'll see we have a quote there from James Madison, being concerned about tyranny when all the powers are gathered together. And it kind of gets into your third chapter where you talk about Federalist Paper number 10, written by James Madison, also Federalist Paper number 51. I think the framers, and in particular James Madison, recognize that you're going to have ambitious individuals, and so you want to have checks and balances. So you had a horizontal distribution of powers, you had a vertical distribution of powers, and today a lot of that has been blurred, and in some respects we're coming back to that definition of tyranny where you don't have the checks and balances that the framers really anticipated.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a matter really of what you think human nature is. And the founders understood man to be, a very flawed being, a fallen being, if you want to use biblical language, who was torn between his reason and his passions. And that was the permanent human condition. And therefore, governments, although necessary and capable of doing indispensable kinds of good for people, is also potentially a threat to their liberty and to their virtue. And you had to keep government, therefore, under observation. And you did that both through elections and through law, through a fundamental law, the Constitution, which Madison is writing about, of course, in the Federalist Papers. And you need both of those. And what happened to America beginning in the progressive years, at the turn of the beginning of the 20th century, is that anthropology, that view of human nature, began to change, and they began to think of man as himself an evolving, a progressive being, sort of combining Charles Darwin's theory of evolution with a progressive style of politics that came from the French Revolution and other places.
Wow.
And when you put those together, you begin to think that human nature is not fixed, but changeable, open-ended, and getting better all the time. And if you believe that, then you can believe that you don't need checks and balances, you don't need separation of powers or federalism. You need to get power into the hands of good people, as much power as possible, so that they can do as much good as possible to their fellow Americans.
Let's take a break, and let me just mention also my booklet on the liberal mind gets into that as well, a very different view of human nature. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about the founder's view and then the progressive view right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the three branches of our constitutional government are the executive, legislative, and judicial. Over the years, you may have written these names on a school test. You may have even shouted them out as answers in a trivia game. But the three branches of government are much more than just a school lesson or a trivia game answer. They're a big reason our freedoms have been protected so well for nearly 250 years. We enjoy such liberty and government continuity because the framers of our Constitution had a belief about human nature that comes from the Bible. While there are good aspects of human nature, there's also great potential for evil because of sin. That's why the framers knew that it would be a very bad idea to concentrate all government power in the hands of just a few people. The three separate branches of government check each other's power, but people in government can still be guilty of overreach. Right now, for example, certain members of Congress are considering measures that would greatly decrease accountability in government. Two of the main ways they are attempting to accomplish this power consolidation are court packing and ending the filibuster. James Madison at one point predicted that the legislative branch of the government would be the greatest threat to the separation of powers. Thankfully, we do have another check on government power in the United States, and that is us. Through elections, local government, U.S. citizens have the ability to hold government accountable when it goes too far. At Point of View, we want you to stay informed about the issues of the day and share important resources with you so that you can stand up for freedom effectively. If you'd like to support Point of View and help more Americans gain access to the kind of information and resources provided on this program, please consider giving or becoming a member of our Truth Team.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Charles Kesler, again of Claremont, and the book is entitled Crisis of the Two Constitutions, The Rise, Decline, and Recovery of American Greatness. Really, we also talk so often about the fact that we have kind of two opposing cultures, two different worldviews, two different contrary views of life, but it goes back to the fact that we sort of have two rival constitutions. And so, Dr. Kesler, you were talking about, of course, the need for us to have some protection against what Madison called factions. And that gets us into another chapter that's worth mentioning, and that is the old idea of civil liberty and religious liberty, something we do talk about oftentimes on this program, because there was an understanding that obviously you would have three separate branches and in somewhat overlapping branches of government, but then you'd also have a vertical distribution. You have certain enumerated powers that would be given to the federal government. The rest were reserved to the states and the people. You also had basically a separation of the institutions of church and state. And so this idea of civil liberty and religious liberty is rooted into the federalism that was drafted by the framers of the Constitution, wasn't it?
Yes, that's very well said. George Washington wrote to one of his friends that the reason he joined the revolution, the reason he became commander-in-chief of the American armies, was for the sake of civil and religious liberty. Mm-hmm. In other words, these two things went together. They were part of what made the American experiment exceptional. it wasn't just that we would have a Republican form of government in which the majority would be able to rule, and certain rights would be protected, but also that the religious mission of from the Pilgrims and the Puritans on down through many, of course, different congregations in America would be honored and would be an essential part of civil society. There would be a whole realm of civil affairs which would be free of government control, but which would still be important to teaching a kind of common morality that would underlie democracy and republicanism and all the formal institutions of the government. If the people didn't have the same civic culture or the same civic morality, they really couldn't trust. The minority could never trust its rights to the majority.
Yes. And
you couldn't have had stable Republican government as we have basically had for a couple of hundred years now. And that the glory really of the American founding is that it worked out a formula so that free people could be good citizens of their political earthly city and still be good citizens of the city of God as well, without any inherent contradiction or any struggle for power between church and state.
Very good. There's so much more in that first section there dealing with, of course, the Founders' Constitution. But a question I'm sure on the minds of most people is, well, where did we go wrong? And that gets into the middle section of your book, The Progressive Constitution, because a very different view of human nature, a very different view of how to interpret the Constitution arose. But you first talk about kind of these three waves of liberalism. Can you kind of give us a little bit of a history lesson in that regard?
I'd be glad to. If you, my late friend Tom Silver used to call the 20th century the liberal century, and I think he was exactly right. This was the century that modern American liberalism was born, and it came to power, and it basically assumed the heights of power for most of the rest of the century. Conservatism, when we think of modern conservatism, it's a late development, really, in the 20th century. Bill Buckley didn't found National Review, the first avowedly conservative magazine, until 1955. Mm-hmm. And conservatives didn't really have a president to call their own until Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980. But we didn't control the House of Representatives until 1994 in the Newt Gingrich's revolution. So 1980 and 1994, the century was almost over before conservatives really had come into their own politically. And so we have to cope with a century, really, of liberal progress and transformation, to use Barack Obama's term. So I call these the three waves. And the first one arose in the progressive period and sort of culminating in the election of Woodrow Wilson in 1912. The second wave was, of course, the New Deal, led by Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. Mm-hmm. And then the third wave, which is a little bit harder to describe because it wasn't so unitary in a way, came in the 1960s. And there you had a kind of you had an establishment part of the liberal revolution led by the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson, but you also had the counter-establishment on the even farther to the left, led by the New Left and Students for a Democratic Society and so forth. And we're basically today still living in the politics of a country transformed by those three waves of liberalism, and especially by the third one. In a certain way, the 60s have never ended, and we're still fighting about the same kinds of issues, the same kind of, liberalizations of sexuality and transformations of morality, and, of course, politics itself, which the 60s began. I'm afraid we're still fighting most of the same battles.
And again, a lot of those individuals who were out on the streets in the 1960s are in the universities today or in the government today. So that is certainly the case. Let's go back and break.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, maybe to break down the three waves a little bit further. You can say in the first wave, we got a new Constitution. Woodrow Wilson was the first president to criticize the American Constitution.
Yes.
And he criticized it because it was essentially, in his view, outdated. It was an 18th century document, but we were facing 20th century problems. And he assumed that all thought, is a child of its time. And as good as that Constitution might have been in the 18th century or even in the first part of the 19th century, it was totally outmoded for fighting 20th century issues. And so we had to replace it with what he called the living Constitution.
Yes.
And liberals still call, their Constitution, the Progressives' Constitution, often by that title, the living Constitution. By living, he meant one that was free to evolve and change quickly in response to changes in society. He meant, of course, also that the old Constitution was a dead Constitution, and that whatever life it might have in it came only because of transfusions of life from the only Constitution that was really alive, the sort of Darwinian evolutionary Constitution of the left. And then in the second wave of liberalism, added to that new Constitution, the living Constitution, was a new Bill of Rights.
Right.
What FDR called a second Bill of Rights. And it is in that, this was a speech of his in which he announced this in 1944, the annual message to Congress. He said, we also, in addition to the first Bill of Rights, the original Bill of Rights, we've got to add a right to health care and a right to a job and a right to a vacation from the job. And all of these rights, which we would now recognize as the basis of the welfare state. These are welfare rights or social and economic rights of various kinds. Now, he never added them formally to the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
They never went through, a vote in the House and the Senate and then in state legislatures. But that was the point, in a way. The new Constitution wasn't the old formal Constitution. And so you would have a living Bill of Rights added to a living Constitution. And finally, beginning in the 60s, we had, in effect, a third Bill of Rights. These are the latest form of progressive moral passion,
Kind of anti-Americanism and things like that, yes.
Yes, and also the right to your own, meaning of the universe, the right to your own identity, yes, to your own culture, to your own values.
Very good. I need to take a break, but I want to come back and talk about that in a little more detail. In particular, I'll get into the whole issue of the administrative state, because that is very different. The government is much larger than the framers would have anticipated, much larger than even somebody in the 19th century would have anticipated. So that's another part of the book, which we are talking about today. Crisis of the Two Constitutions, the Rise, Decline, and Recovery of American Greatness. And we'll continue our conversation right after this.
According to one definition, a catalyst is an agent that provokes or speeds significant change or action. According to founder James Madison, tyranny is the accumulation of all powers in the same hands. So what do those definitions have to do with each other? Here's the disturbing truth. Members of the federal government are blatantly trying to seize as much power as possible, pushing us toward tyranny. To stop tyranny, we need a catalyst. You. The most important check on government tyranny is the American people. But many Americans don't know how to stand up to the government. They need access to programs like Point of View, where listeners are not just informed, but empowered to take meaningful action. When you give to Point of View, you become a catalyst because you're giving more people the tools they need to stand for freedom. Be the catalyst America needs to stop tyranny. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Charles Kesler, and the book is entitled Crisis of the Two Constitutions, The Rise, Decline, and Recovery of American Greatness. If you'd like to understand more about how we got to where we are today and why we have, if you will, two different views of the Constitution and how to respond to it, this book has been out for a couple of months. We have a link to it so you can get it in hardback or Kindle. And again, we'll also talk a little bit about some of the resources that would be available through the Claremont Institute Institute. But Charles, just to maybe summarize for anybody taking some notes, the first one under Woodrow Wilson, kind of a new Constitution, a new view of the Constitution. Under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, kind of a new set of Bill of Rights, or the Bill of Rights of the welfare state. And then the third is kind of an ongoing revolution of the 60s and multiculturalism and liberalism and diversity, which is still existing till this day, because in some respects, those three waves crashing to the shore of America changed, as you said, the 20th century into kind of the century of liberalism, and to this day we're still feeling all the effects of it, aren't we?
Yes, we are, unfortunately, Kerby. I mean, it's not, we have had some innings. Conservatives and constitutionalists have had some innings. We have won some fights that were important, but we haven't really been able to revive, you might say, the basic political and moral and constitutional postulates of the original Constitution. We have some good Supreme Court justices, maybe not as good as we hope, some of them, but they do disappoint occasionally. But still, the fight is very much ongoing, and something that has taken almost 100 years to be put in place won't be overturned or, reformed in one presidential term. It's going to take a long-term, almost, I would think, generational effort to sort of revive the founders' Constitution as over against the progressives one.
Well, that's what we're dedicated to. Let me get to Chapter 9, because that's another element that I've mentioned, but it would be worth going into, and that is kind of the rise of the administrative state. I mentioned our biblical view of the liberal mind. Of course, I quote from Friedrich Hayek, who you're familiar with, The Road to Serfdom, even a piece I did on the bureaucracy and the so-called deep state. Today, we are in a situation where the bureaucracy makes more and more and more of the decisions. And if you want to get a perspective of that, just pick up a piece of legislation I've used on this example before. Pick up the Affordable Care Act, called Obamacare. The number of times where it says, as the Secretary of Health and Human Services shall determine. And almost all the decisions that used to be a function or within the purview of the Congress have been delegated now to this expansive bureaucracy, much larger than I think the framers or even people in the 19th century, even the early part of the 20th century, would have ever anticipated.
No, and, the result is that Congress is, in a way, an increasingly dysfunctional branch of government, because it really doesn't have a clear job anymore. Under the original Constitution, it's supposed to be the lawmaking branch. In a way, your teacher, George Carey, and his teacher, Wilmore Kendall, thought that there was a kind of constitutional morality that to a large degree centered on the legislative branch. It was the branch where compromises were possible, where local interests were heard and their views were, refined and enlarged, as James Madison said, into the laws of the country. But Congress really makes very few laws anymore. The laws are made by the unelected administrators in the administrative state, as you were saying, and partly, of course, the laws are made by the unelected judges in the federal courts, and especially on the Supreme Court. If you think of a large subject like affirmative action, for example, there are really no federal laws about affirmative action. It's all judge-made law or law issuing from government agencies of one kind or another. There's really very little in the way of people's law about it. There's some in the states, of course, but really there's almost nothing at the federal level. This is a whole field where we're being governed by ordinances, in effect, made by bureaucrats and judges.
Very true. And again, as you said, this is something that's taken more than 100 years to unfold. It's not going to change within the blink of the eye, and it's certainly another issue that we want to continue to talk about here on Point of View. But before you were on, we did talk a little bit about the crisis at the border, and your chapter on From Citizenship to Multiculturalism, I think, first of all, illustrates a couple of issues. What it used to mean when you were a citizen of the United States, or if you became a naturalized citizen, and then this whole idea of multiculturalism, which is, again, coming out of the 60s, and this desire to no longer have any kind of assumed if you will, commitments, because I've always said that America is more of an idea. If you try to identify other countries, well, to be Japanese is to be of Japanese origin, to be Swedish is to be Swedish origin, but we've always been a multicultural country, and we've always pulled together various culture, but we recognize out of the many becomes one, and we recognize that there were certain kind of foundational truths, but that has changed dramatically, and you talk about that in Chapter 10.
Yes, unfortunately, we're in a kind of, if you look at the, last year was a very eventful year politically, and not just because Donald Trump lost an election. But if you think of the attacks on statues of George Washington and Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln and even Abigail Adams, I don't think the country's really ever seen anything like that before. Most elections don't feature pulling down statues of American heroes. And this wasn't, it's true that it began a couple of years before with controversy over statues of Confederate generals. But we're not talking Confederate generals anymore. We're talking mainstream American presidents and heroes and, figures of religious and intellectual significance in the country. We're talking about the people who help to define what America is, the heroes of American life. And when young people begin to roam around in mobs and pull them down, you have a kind of, this is the beginning of a kind of revolutionary situation. Who's going to go up? Whose statues are they going to erect in place of those they're pulling down? And no one really knows, I think, yet what direction this kind of revolutionary energy is going to go in. But it's a new thing in our politics, and a very worrisome thing in our politics. And I think it speaks to what could be called multiculturalism or identity politics. They really do want to replace the old America with a refounded America, a new America of group identity, group culture, group rights, not the old America, which precisely because it was based upon individual dignity and individual rights, could accommodate many different kinds of cultures, people from England, people from Germany, people from Ireland, from Mexico, from Italy, from a lot of places around the world, could become American citizens because there was one common civic culture that they were joining. They had many other local cultures and ethnic cultures and so forth, no doubt about that. But they were able to thrive because there was an agreement, more fundamental than the cultural disagreements that Italians and Englishmen brought to the country. And that's, I think, what we've lost, or rather are in danger of losing.
Very good. We need to take a break. When we come back, we want to talk about the kind of so what question. How can we move from there? Ronald Reagan's kind of unfinished revolution. What about Donald Trump and all of the rest? But I love how you ended this section because you were talking about the old left and the new left, and used Bill Ayers, William Ayers, who was actually part of the Students for Democratic Society. Bill Ayers introduced to the world a man by the name of Barack Obama. I think most people know who he is. And then I love how you ended. Bill Ayers is became a tenured professor of education. So no longer on the outside, but on the inside. When we come back, let's talk a little bit about where do we go from here? Are there some lessons we can learn as we have spent some time talking about this crisis of the two constitutions? What's ahead in the 21st century? We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk about the crisis of the two constitutions, the rise, decline, and recovery of American greatness. It's an encounter book. We have information about that on our website. Also have a link to Claremont.org. That will give you information about the Claremont Review of Books. And, of course, we're talking today with the editor of that. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the Claremont Institute or Claremont McKenna College, maybe you have a young person heading off to college or thinking about that, those are some great resources. Of course, we also have on the program before had both in studio and by phone Rachel Bovard, and she's a Lincoln Fellow with them. So there are just a number of things that when you click on the various links would be helpful to you. But I thought, Charles, just for a few more minutes, we might, and I know it's a huge section, talk about at least two individuals, Ronald Reagan, and you called it Reagan's Unfinished Revolution, and then maybe at least a little bit about Donald Trump and this whole idea of populism. And in the midst of that, of course, you also talk about what's wrong with conservatism. So I don't know we have time to cover all of that, but I think it's important to just recognize that we've been saying, okay, here's the problem. And I think we've illustrated the fact that we need some intellectual firepower. We need dedicated individuals. We need people to believe in these conservative principles. But what else do we need to do?
Well, it's it's as you say, an enormous subject in a way. But on the other hand, it's in principle rather straightforward. We need to find a way to reinforce the older constitutional understanding, which is not at all departed. I mean, the original Constitution is still there. The three branches, the separation of powers, federalism are still there. It's just that they're overlaid by this new progressive Constitution, which is inhibiting the proper operation of the original, institutions of government, and it is distorting our government and twisting it in ways which, as you say, are very hostile to liberty. Certainly one of the firing lines that we need to be manning right now are school boards and elections for state, state school boards, and sometimes they're elected trustees of state universities and so forth. These are very important because the argument that we're faced with now is whether America is a nation of systemic racism, as the 1619 Project and critical race theory and many people on the left say, including the president, or whether America is a country of systemic justice. Is it systemically unjust or systemically just? And it's very hard to have one country in which people disagree so violently about whether the country itself is worth preserving or not, or whether it is only worth transforming. And that, in a way, is the big issue. Ronald Reagan tried to and succeeded to a certain extent in reviving American patriotism, in addition to the many other great things that he accomplished as a president. But he himself, in his farewell address, which is one of the I would say understudied documents of his presidency. We don't really talk about it much, but it's a very interesting address, his farewell address, in which he admitted that there was one thing he had failed at, and it was a big thing. And that is that even though he had revived American patriotism, he hadn't institutionalized that revival.
Yes.
And so he said he grew up in a different America than the America that he was president of. Meaning there had been a kind of regime change at home. Parents didn't know what to teach their children about patriotism anymore. They didn't think that it was intellectually respectable. Well, programs like yours are helping to make American patriotism intellectually defensible and respectable. That's the basic thing that has to be the indispensable thing for any political reforms that are to come. Now, Trump is an interesting character because he is, he never used the term populist, I don't think, or at least he didn't use it thematically, but he was often called a populist. He called himself a nationalist. But what he was a variety of conservative. Conservatism since the 1950s, modern conservatism, has always had a very important populist turn to it. From the very beginning, conservatism was opposing what it called the establishment of the Eastern liberal Republican control of the Republican Party, first of all, and then the greater liberal establishment in the universities and in Washington, D.C. and state capitals. We've always been a kind of outside rebellion, a country party rebellion against the court party, against a corrupt central government and cultural establishment. That wasn't new. What was new was the vigor, I think, and to a certain extent the vulgarity of it as well. But I would say the vigor with which Trump fought the liberal establishment. It was for that reason that they hated him and did everything they could, really, in unprecedented ways, I think, to obstruct him and to bring him down. Now, he had a part in his own failure, I think, no doubt about that. But it shows you at least that if we have the courage and the wisdom to fight the new establishment, it's not hopeless. I think much can be done, and I hope will be done in the years to come to sort of combine Reagan and Trumpian policies and modes of government and campaigning to make the revival of the Founders' Constitution something that's really possible after 100 years of liberal transformation.
Again, if you look at the individuals, we've talked about this with Kelly Shackelford so many times, the people that are on the various appeals courts and federal courts, if you will, the farm team for the Supreme Court. Of course, we can look at 3 Supreme Court justices on the Supreme Court, but you look at all the others, we have more that we have to work with than we did, say, a couple of years ago. So if nothing else, your book really helps us understand how we got here and where we need to go in the future. We have a link so that if people would like to know more about the book, or if they'd like to know more about the Claremont review of the books or the Claremont Institute, we have all those links on our website at pointofview.net. And so, Dr. Charles Kesler, I appreciated the book. I've had a chance to watch you on YouTube from time to time, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Thank you very much, Kirby. It's, as I said, a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Well, we will take a break, and then tomorrow we will get into a lot of those issues in the news that I didn't have a chance to cover today. So we're going to do that, and especially when we look at this issue of critical race theory, we've had a couple of governors, one in Georgia, one in the state of Florida, that said, no, we're not doing critical race theory. Critical race theory is being taught in the military. We have an individual that's written a book about that. We're going to talk about those issues. We're going to get into all sorts of other aspects that we didn't cover today. Maybe also take another quick look at the issue of immigration. And then in the second hour, our good friend Jim Dennison will be with us, and we will be talking about a number of the issues he has raised on his daily article, many of those which will be related to in the first hour tomorrow as well. But just before I say goodbye, please take the time to visit our website, pointofview.net, especially if you want to learn a little bit more about this issue of government overreach. That's my commentary for today. And if you value some of the kind of news, information, and commentary that we cover, could I ask you maybe to click on that button that says Donate Now, because we are facing a time in which there has been government overreach, and we've been talking about that today with Dr. Charles Kesler. So you could choose your gift and make a gift and help support this ministry, and we would greatly appreciate it. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
According to one definition, a catalyst is an agent that provokes or speeds significant change or action. According to founder James Madison, tyranny is the accumulation of all powers in the same hands. So what do those definitions have to do with each other? Here's the disturbing truth. Members of the federal government are blatantly trying to seize as much power as possible, pushing us toward tyranny. To stop tyranny, we need a catalyst. You. The most important check on government tyranny is the American people. But many Americans don't know how to stand up to the government. They need access to programs like Point of View, where listeners are not just informed, but empowered to take meaningful action. When you give to Point of View, you become a catalyst because you're giving more people the tools they need to stand for freedom. Be the catalyst America needs to stop tyranny. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.